In the long, blood-stained history of American crime, one name stands alone: the first man to turn murder into architecture, science, and deception. They called him America's first serial killer. But in truth, Holmes was something more ancient, a man who built his own hell and invited the world inside. Holmes was born as Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, the third child of Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, both of whom were descended from the first English settlers in the area. He had two older siblings, Ellen and Arthur, and one younger brother, Henry. As an adolescent, Holmes attended Phillips Exeter Academy before graduating high school with honors from Gilmanton Academy when he was 16. Holmes's parents were both devout Methodists. His father was from a farming family, and at times worked as a farmer, trader, and house painter. He was also reportedly a heavy drinker who cruelly beat his children. Holmes also faced bullying by classmates due to his outstanding academic capabilities. In one incident, he was forced to stand in front of a human skeleton and put the skeleton's hands on his face in an effort to frighten him. Initially terrified, Holmes later discovered the experience to be intriguing and claimed that it helped him overcome his worries. Holmes subsequently developed an obsession with death as a result of the encounter, and began dissecting animals. In 1879, Holmes enrolled at the University of Vermont for 1 year. In 1882, he transferred to the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. Despite his mediocre academic performance, Holmes graduated in June 1884. While enrolled, he worked in the anatomy lab under Professor William James Herdman, then the chief anatomy instructor, and the two were said to have been engaged in facilitating body snatching to supply medical cadavers. Holmes had apprenticed in New Hampshire under Nahum White, a noted advocate of human dissection. 5 years later, when Holmes was suspected of murder and claimed to be nothing but an insurance fraudster, he admitted to using cadavers to defraud life insurance companies several times in college. Educated, polite, and devilishly charming, he was everything a 19th-century gentleman should be. And yet behind that calm smile was something far darker, a mind that would create one of the most horrifying legends in United States history. "I was born with the devil in me," Holmes would later confess. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, any more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." Herman Mudgett's childhood was not the tortured one that newspapers later invented. His parents were strict but stable, deeply religious Methodists. He was bright, too bright, curious about everything, especially the human body. At 13, a cruel group of classmates dragged him into a doctor's office and forced him to confront a human skeleton. It was meant to terrify him. Instead, the pale bones fascinated him. Something inside the boy awakened, not fear but obsession. He spent hours reading about anatomy, physiology, and dissection. By the time he was 16, that curiosity had turned into ambition. At 16, Herman met Clara Lovering, a kind and trusting young woman. He courted her fiercely, possessively, unable to stand the idea of losing her. When she looked at another man, he threatened violence. And yet she forgave him, and on July 4, 1878, they married. Both were just teenagers. Soon after, Clara gave birth to their son, Robert Mudgett. But Herman was restless. He dreamed not of family life but of science and power. Leaving his wife behind, he went to study medicine, first at the University of Vermont, then transferring to the University of Michigan in 1882. There, his brilliance flourished, and his morals vanished. He began stealing cadavers from the medical school, taking out insurance policies on them, and faking accidental deaths to claim the money. At the dissection tables, surrounded by death, he seemed completely at ease. Other students joked that he could carve the devil's dinner and not blink. But when one student accused him of being a fraud, Holmes beat him senseless. Already the mask was slipping. By 1884, with his degree in hand, Herman Webster Mudgett was ready to disappear. He abandoned his wife and child, and by 1886 he had re-emerged in Chicago as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Chicago was booming. The railroads, the factories, the coming World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. It was a city built on ambition and deceit, the perfect place for a man like Holmes. He found work at a small pharmacy on 63rd Street and Wallace Avenue. The elderly owners soon vanished. Holmes told neighbors they'd retired to California. In truth, they were never heard from again. Across the street, he purchased a vacant lot. Brick by brick, he began constructing the building that would become infamous as the Murder Castle. From the outside, It looked like any other city block, 3 stories of brick and stone, a mix of shops and apartments. But inside was a labyrinth of terror. Stairways that led nowhere. Windowless rooms sealed tight. Hidden chutes that dropped straight into the basement. And in that basement, a furnace large enough to cremate a human body. Holmes supervised every detail. He hired and fired workers constantly so no one could understand the full plan. He told one it was a hotel, another that it would be offices, another still that he needed secret vaults for business records. All of them were telling the truth, in their own way. His first known victim was Julia Connor, the wife of a jeweler who rented a shop in his building. Holmes seduced her, drove her husband away and promised to marry her. On Christmas Eve 1891, Julia and her little daughter Pearl vanished. Holmes said they'd gone to visit relatives. They never returned. The following year, Emmeline Sigrand, a beautiful stenographer, disappeared as well. Holmes told friends she'd gone to Europe. No one believed it, but there was no proof otherwise. Then came Minnie Williams, a Texas heiress who inherited property worth thousands. Holmes married her under false pretenses in 1893, convincing her to transfer the deed of her land to a mysterious Alexander Bond, one of his many aliases. Soon after, Minnie's sister Nanny Williams arrived in Chicago. Within a week, both sisters were gone. And this is. Holmes moved to Chicago in August 1886, which is when he began using the pseudonym H. H. Holmes. Soon after his arrival, he came across a drugstore at the northwest corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in the Englewood section of Chicago. 18, the drugstore's owner, Elizabeth Holton, gave Holmes a job. He proved to be a hard-working employee, eventually buying the store. Contrary to several accounts, Holmes did not kill Dry V.S. Holton. Holmes purchased an empty lot across the street, where construction began in 1887 for a 2-story mixed-use building, with apartments on the second floor and retail spaces, including a new drugstore on the first. When Holmes declined to pay the architects or the steel company, Etna Iron and Steel, they took him to court in 1888. In 1892 he added a 3rd floor, telling investors and suppliers he intended to use it as a hotel during the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition. Contemporary accounts report that Holmes built the hotel to lure tourists visiting the exposition in order to kill them and sell their skeletons to nearby medical schools. Although he did have a history of selling stolen cadavers to medical schools, Holmes had acquired these wares through body snatching rather than murder. Likewise, there is no evidence that Holmes ever murdered exposition-goers on the premises. The yellow press labeled the building as Holmes's murder castle, claiming the structure contained secret torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers and a basement crematorium. None of these sensationalized claims were true. Other accounts stated that the hotel was made up of over 100 rooms and laid out like a maze, with doors opening into brick walls, windowless rooms and dead-end staircases. In reality, the 3rd-floor hotel was moderately sized, largely unremarkable and uncompleted due to Holmes's disputes with the builders. It did contain some hidden rooms, but they were used for hiding furniture Holmes bought on credit and did not intend to pay for. Holmes did not kill an alleged castle victim, Miss Kate Durkee, who turned out to be very much alive. In his confession, Holmes stated that his usual method of killing was to suffocate his victims using various means, including an overdose of chloroform, overexposure to lighting gas fumes, and trapping them in an airless vault. Holmes also claimed to have used starvation, and to have burnt victims alive in his castle. Holmes's hotel was gutted by a fire started by an unknown arsonist shortly after his arrest, but was largely rebuilt and used as a post office until 1938. Besides his infamous murder castle, Holmes also owned a 1-story factory which he claimed was to be used for glass bending. It is unclear if the factory furnace was ever used for this purpose. It was speculated to have been used to destroy incriminating evidence of Holmes's crimes. In 1893, Chicago dazzled the world with its Columbian Exposition, a celebration of progress, electricity, and wonder. Holmes saw it as an opportunity. He transformed his building's upper floors into what he called the World's Fair Hotel, promising luxury for visiting tourists. But no guest records survive. Some who checked in were never seen again. Behind locked doors, Holmes experimented. Some victims were suffocated by hidden gas pipes. Others were locked inside soundproof vaults, where he could watch their agony through peepholes. Afterward, their bodies slid down hidden chutes to the basement furnace or acid vats. And yet outside, Holmes smiled, a successful businessman, a charming host, a doctor of remarkable kindness. The perfect predator. By the end of 1893, creditors were circling. Holmes set fire to the third floor for the insurance payout, but the company refused to pay, so he fled. Over the next year he drifted across Illinois, Indiana, Ontario, and Pennsylvania, leaving unpaid debts, missing women, and confused police in every city. He married again to Georgiana Yoke, while still wed to 2 other women. He defrauded merchants, conned investors, and began plotting his most elaborate scam, an insurance scheme with a man named Benjamin Pittesel. While working in the chemical bank building on Dearborn Street, Holmes met and became close friends with 38-year-old Benjamin Freeland Pittesel, a carpenter with a criminal past who was exhibiting a coal bin he had invented in the same building. Holmes used Pittesel as his right-hand man for several criminal schemes. A district attorney later described Pittesel as Holmes's tool, his creature. With insurance companies pressing to prosecute him for arson, Holmes left Chicago in July 1894. He reappeared in Fort Worth, where he had inherited property from the Williams sisters at the intersection of modern-day Commerce Street and 2nd Street. Here he once again attempted to build an incomplete structure without paying his suppliers and contractors. In July 1894, Holmes was arrested and briefly jailed for the first time on the charge of selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis, Missouri. He was promptly bailed out, but while in jail he struck up a conversation with a convicted outlaw named Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes had concocted a plan to swindle an insurance company out of $10,000 by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his death. Holmes promised Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted. Holmes was directed to a young St. Louis attorney named Jephthah Howe. Howe thought Holmes's scheme was brilliant and agreed to participate. Nevertheless, Holmes's plan to fake his own death failed when the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay. Holmes did not press the claim. Instead, he concocted a similar plan with Pittesel. Pittesel agreed to fake his own death so that his wife could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy, which he was to split with Holmes and Howe. The scheme, which was to take place in Philadelphia, called for Pittesel to set himself up as an inventor under the name B.F. Perry, and then be killed and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Pittesel. Instead, Holmes killed Pittesel on September 4, 1894, by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and setting his body on fire with benzene. In his confession, Holmes implied Pittesel was still alive after he used the chloroform on him, before he set him on fire. However, forensic evidence presented at Holmes's later trial showed chloroform had been administered after Pittesel's death, a fact of which the insurance company was unaware, presumably to stage a suicide to exonerate Holmes should he be charged with murder. Holmes collected the insurance payout on the basis of the genuine Pittesel corpse. Holmes then manipulated Pittesel's unsuspecting wife, Carrie Alice Canning, into allowing 3 of her 5 children to be placed in his custody. The 3 children who were placed under Holmes's care were 13-year-old Alice Pittesel, 9-year-old Nellie Pittesel, and 7-year-old Howard Robert Pittesel. Holmes and the 3 Pittesel children traveled throughout the northeastern United States and into Canada. He simultaneously escorted Carrie along a parallel route, all the while using various aliases and lying to Carrie concerning her husband's death by claiming Pittesel was hiding in London, as well as lying to her about the true whereabouts of her 3 missing children. In Detroit, just before entering Canada, they were separated by only a few blocks. In an even more audacious move, Holmes was staying at another location with his current wife, who was unaware of the whole affair. Holmes later confessed to murdering Alice and Nellie on October 25, 1894, by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He drilled a hole in the lid of the trunk and put one end of a hose through the hole, attaching the other end to a gas line to asphyxiate the girls. Holmes buried their nude bodies in the cellar of his rental house at 16 St. Vincent Street in Toronto. Frank Geyer was a Philadelphia Police Department detective assigned to investigate Holmes and find the 3 missing children. Geyer began in June 1894 to trace Holmes's steps and found the decomposed bodies of the 2 Pittesel girls in the cellar of the Toronto home. The detective wrote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being." In Toronto, Geyer discovered unsent letters written by the Pittesel children that Holmes had kept. This information led to further investigations of Holmes's Chicago property and ultimately led Geyer to Indianapolis, where Holmes had rented a home in the Irvington neighborhood. Holmes was reported to have visited a local pharmacy to purchase the drugs which he used to kill Howard Pitezel on October 10, 1894, and a repair shop to sharpen the knives he used to chop up the body before he burned it. The boy's teeth and bone were discovered in the Holmes chimney. But to think of it, Holmes and Pitezel planned to fake Pitezel's death and split the insurance money. But when Pitezel grew nervous, Holmes decided to make the lie real. Holmes killed Pitezel, dousing him in chloroform, then setting his body on fire to make it look like an accident. He convinced Pitezel's wife, Carrie, that her husband was alive under a false name and that he needed help relocating their children. They never arrived. Investigators later found the children's bodies buried in shallow graves and cellars across 2 states. Alice and Nellie had been suffocated in a trunk. Howard was found in a fireplace, his remains partially burned. The discoveries horrified even veteran detectives. One of them, after opening the cellar floor where the girls were buried, whispered, "This is no man. This is something that crawled out of hell." Holmes's murder spree finally ended when he was arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, after being tracked there from Philadelphia by the private Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas because the authorities had become more suspicious at this point, and Holmes appeared poised to flee the country in the company of his unsuspecting third wife. In July 1895, following the discovery of Alice and Nellie's bodies, Chicago police and reporters began investigating Holmes's building in Englewood, now locally referred to as the Castle. Though many sensational claims were made, no evidence was found which could have convicted Holmes in Chicago. There was only very circumstantial physical evidence of the Castle victims: a piece of human bone possibly from Julia Connor, remains of a child possibly Pearl Connor, a burned gold watch chain and burned dress buttons, apparently belonging to Minnie Williams, and a tuft of human female hair found in a chimney flue. Thus Holmes would be tried for the murder of Pitezel in Philadelphia, which had the clearest case for murder. In October 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, and was found guilty and sentenced to death. By then, it was evident Holmes had also murdered the 3 missing Pitezel children. Following his conviction, Holmes confessed to 27 murders in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, and 6 attempted murders. Holmes was paid $7,500 by the Hearst newspapers in exchange for his confession. While writing his confessions in prison, Holmes mentioned how drastically his facial appearance had changed since his imprisonment. Sketch of a hanging scene with multiple figures. Sketch of Holmes during his execution while he was making his final address. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison for the murder of Pitezel. Until the moment of his death, Holmes remained calm and amiable, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. Despite this, he asked for his coffin to be contained in concrete and buried 10 feet deep, because he was concerned body snatchers would steal his body and use it for dissection. Holmes's neck did not break. He instead strangled to death slowly, twitching for over 15 minutes before being pronounced dead. Upon his execution, Holmes's body was interred in an unmarked grave at Holy Cross Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery in the Philadelphia western suburb of Yeadon, Pennsylvania. On New Year's Eve 1909, Hedgepeth, who had been pardoned for informing on Holmes, was shot and killed by police officer Edward Jaburek during a hold-up at a Chicago bar. On March 7, 1914, the Chicago Tribune reported that, with the death of Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle, the mysteries of Holmes's castle would remain unexplained. Quinlan had committed suicide by taking strychnine. His body was found in his bedroom with a note that read, "I couldn't sleep." Quinlan's surviving relatives claimed he had been haunted for several months and was suffering from hallucinations. The castle itself was damaged by a fire in August 1895. 2 men were seen entering the back of the building at 9 p.m. About half an hour later, they were seen exiting the building and rapidly running away. Following several explosions, the castle went up in flames. Afterwards, investigators found a half-empty gas can underneath the back steps of the building. The building survived the fire and remained in use until it was torn down in 1938. The site is currently occupied by the Englewood branch of the United States Postal Service. In 2017, during allegations Holmes had escaped execution, Holmes's body was exhumed for testing led by Janet Monge of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Due to his coffin being contained in concrete, his body was found to not have decomposed normally. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved and his mustache was found to be intact. The body was positively identified by his teeth as being that of Holmes. He was then reburied. His crimes blurred the line between fact and myth. Even now, it's hard to separate the truth from the legend, because Holmes wanted it that way. He designed his own infamy. "If I am to be remembered," he once told a reporter, "let it be as the man who could not resist what was already in his nature." In an age of progress and invention, he built a monument to darkness. While the world celebrated electric lights and industry, Holmes built hidden corridors, gas-sealed vaults, and a furnace for human souls. He was not a monster from folklore. He was something far worse, a man who smiled, shook your hand, and led you upstairs.